When we read in the New Testament about the kingdom, one of the things that constantly pops up throughout all of the New Testament is this idea that the kingdom is here, but not yet here. And we see this a little bit in the idea of the church, right? We, as Christians, if we belong to the church, we are a part of this kingdom that Jesus came to establish. He established it by establishing the church, and we get to benefit from this kingdom while we are here. We have freedom from our sins. We get to participate in this new life that we have in Christ. But there is a sense that we don't yet participate in all of it, right? When we think of the kingdom, we sometimes think about heaven and God coming down with all of his glory, and we know that as we live here on earth, we've not yet experienced that. And so there's this sense that the kingdom is here, but not yet fully here. And when we understand that, we can often be left with the question of when. When is it that Jesus fully establishes his church here on earth? When is it that we get to be with him in all of his glory and all of the greatness that is who he is? This is the question that the disciples asked Jesus near the end of the book of Matthew. We've been studying Matthew since January, and we've been going through different aspects of Matthew from this perspective of kingdom. The last series we went through, we kind of talked about questions that Jesus was asked by the religious leaders in Matthew 22, where Jesus was asked political questions and theological questions and philosophical questions. And this question that we're going to look at today comes right after that. It's the same day Jesus has just gotten done answering all of these questions, and he's decided to head back to the place that he's staying at. He's not staying in Jerusalem. It's way overcrowded. He is staying outside in a little town called Bethany. And as Jesus travels to Bethany, the disciples look up at the temple, and they look at it and they see how marvelous it was, and they say, Jesus, look how beautiful and how grand this temple is. And to be fair, the temple was grand. It had just undergone a big renovation process that had lasted like 30 some odd years. Herod the king had brought in these large white stones to overlay the temple, and he decorated those stones with gold, and when the sun hit it just right, it shined. And you could see it for miles because the temple covered 1/6 of the city. It was a huge complex, and for distance, that was all you would see of Jerusalem. It was a marvelous sight to behold. And so it's no wonder that the disciples look at Jesus and say, look at how beautiful this is. But in response, Jesus simply says, I tell you the truth, not one of these stones will remain. And Jesus more or less says, don't worry about the beauty of it. It is all coming down. And this disturbs the disciples so much that as they are walking, they stop for a moment to rest, and they come to Jesus at the beginning of Matthew 24, and they ask him this question in verse 3. It says, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, and they said, tell us, when will these things happen? When will the stones of Jerusalem be torn down? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? See, they were Jewish to the core of who they were, and for them, the temple was the sign of the glory of God on earth. And so to hear that the temple would be destroyed, they marveled at what that meant. And so they asked Jesus, when would these things happen? And they asked a second question that for them was associated, when is the signs that you will return? When is your kingdom coming in all of its glory? We're going to look at just that second question. When is Jesus coming back? What's unfortunate for us is that Jesus makes it pretty clear about halfway through his conversation that lasts from chapter 24 to 25 exactly what the signs of his coming are. In verse 36, Jesus says it this way. He says, about that day, when I come back, or that hour, no one knows. Not the angels that are in heaven, not the Son. I don't even know. Only God knows, and God has yet to tell any one of us. What's interesting is that we've speculated as Christians over and over again about when Jesus is coming back. There was a book that was written in the early months of 1988, and it had this title, 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Come Back in 1988. There were 88 reasons why that author was not correct. That author, in fact, wrote a book in 1989 that was entitled 89 Reasons Why Jesus Will Come Back in 1989, and he, again, got 89 reasons wrong. And we look at that, and that's just one. We can laugh kind of at it, but he's just one of many people that have tried to guess when Jesus would come back. There have been times where Christians have been found standing on the streets because they said Jesus is coming back, and they would be looking up into the heavens, or they'd be dressed in white because when Jesus comes back, you want to be pure, and they'd be standing on their rooftops, and they were waiting for Jesus to return. And so Jesus tells his disciples, we don't know. And the signs, there are none. Only God knows when the kingdom will come into its fullness. And the rest of what Jesus says, starting from verse 36 of chapter 24, all the way through the end of chapter 25, is Jesus trying to explain to his disciples just exactly what we are to do while we wait. And the essence of it is this: we are to be ready and we are to keep watch. There is importance in keeping watch in our duties as Christians. In 2007, in the Kuban region of southern Russia, there was a fire that struck a nursing home. It was a home for the elderly. And it ended up killing 62 people in this fire. And what they found out as they were investigating was that there was a man sitting there whose only job was to make sure that everybody was safe. And that man ignored 2 fire alarms. Oh, that's just a problem with the system. It wasn't until the 3rd fire alarm went off and he saw the flames that he realized, hey, there's actually a fire going on. And they started to rouse everybody, and other people weren't at their stations. And when we're not keeping watch, bad things happen. We as Christians must keep watch and be ready for when Jesus returns. To illustrate this, Jesus tells a series of parables in Matthew 25 that we're going to look at. We're going to look at 2 of them in detail and kind of skim one at the end of this sermon to kind of give you a picture of what it means to be ready, to keep watch, and to be alert for the coming of Jesus. We read the first parable in Matthew 25, starting in verse 1. I invite you to turn with you in your Bibles, Matthew 25, verse 1, and this is called the parable of the foolish and wise girls. Here's how it reads, starting in verse 1, verse through 4. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and they went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but they did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, they took oil in jars along with their lamps. What we have here is a parable that tells about a wedding. We studied parables earlier in this year. I just want to kind of reiterate one thing. We shouldn't make parables allegories. And what I mean by that is not every part of the story means something. So there's not anything significant with the torches or the number 10 or anything like that. It is simply a story that takes place about a wedding. Weddings in most cultures are times of festivities. We go all out for weddings in America. There was a study that was done in 2016 that looked across America and said, how much does it cost on average, to have a wedding? And the average cost was $35,000. And some of us are like, that's crazy, right? Some of us are like, man, that's better than what I paid, right? No. We go all out. And what they have found in that study was the reason that people go all out is because we want to make it memorable and to stand out from everybody else. And so there's this idea of social media driving the cost of weddings up. We want to do something that people are going to take pictures of and post it on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or whatever social media we use. And we want people to know about it. And we go all out in ours. But in the Jewish world, it wasn't that much different. Jewish world, in the first century, they celebrated weddings as a community. There's stories of rabbis who would be teaching, and then the wedding march would come right by down the street, and they would stop their teaching to walk in the parade to celebrate and congratulate this couple. And rather than having a reception that lasted for a couple of hours, their receptions lasted for 7 days. So imagine that, sitting at your house for 7 days while people come in to give you presents. The newlywed couple would be the prince and the princess of the town, and people would show deference to them. And it was a big, epic festival. And everyone wanted to be a part of it. And so that's the background to this story. And the weddings in that culture, they began with the settlement of the dowry. Now, a dowry is not something we are used to in our current setting, but in their culture, again, everybody in their family was an integral part of making the family operate. And so, whoever you were doing something to benefit the family, whether it's making food or making something to get money to buy food. All right, and so even this lady who has just been wedded off, she was an integral part of their family, and so the groom would come in with a dowry to pay for any inconvenience there was because you were losing a set of hands that was helping out the rest of the family. The dowry would often be decided way in advance, about a year or more. This is how much I think that you need to supplement what this daughter was doing. But on the day of the wedding, that's when the dowry was settled. And they didn't just bring in a checkbook. They didn't bring in a wad of cash. They brought in other things like sheep. Okay? And so then there'd be this haggling process, right? Because I have this sheep that I think is worth $10, and the father of the bride is thinking, no, it's only worth $1. All right, and obviously there's a disconnect there, and so there's some haggling, and then we finally decide on an appropriate price for this sheep, and then I bring in my next thing, which might be a vase or whatever, something to help out the family. And so there's this constant haggling, and it would have lasted for quite a while, sometimes just a couple of minutes, sometimes hours. It just depended on how hard of a haggler you were. And so we have this scene of the groom going off to do this, and then you have these bridesmaids. And the bridesmaids, their job was to light the streets for the festival. Once the bridegroom was done, he would start to march through the town. And it could have been during the middle of the day, but often it happened at night. And so these bridegrooms would have these lamps that were like these sticks with cloth that had been soaked in oil that they would light and would give light out to the entire city. And they would march around the city, and they would meet the groom, and they would escort him back to his house where the wedding would take place. And so this is the scene. There's these 10 bridesmaids. They have gone out to meet the groom. 5 of them are wise in that they've prepared for more than one lighting of their torches. The torches would have only lasted about 15 minutes, maybe. All right, and the other ones are foolish, where they're expecting to meet the groom right now and to lead him on the way. And so that's the scene. All right, and in the rest of the story, we find 4 truths about the coming of Jesus that I think we can apply to our lives. The first truth is this: the coming of Jesus is unknown. And we read about it in verse 5, and here's what happens in this story. The bridegroom was long time in coming, and they, the wise and foolish girls, they all became drowsy and they fell asleep. What we see is there's a delay in the coming of the groom. Delays happened in that setting, but this one was extremely long. It lasted well into night. We're told it's about midnight before the groom is finally done. Now, if we were wanting to stay up till midnight, we have the benefit of having electricity. And so we would just turn on the lights in our house, maybe turn on the TV, watch something. There's been many nights where I've sat there and started a TV show, and it was like 2 o'clock in the morning before I realized what I was doing, right? All right, so we have the benefit of having that type of technology. But for them, that wasn't the case. It gets dark somewhat early, and say 8 o'clock right now, and imagine having to stay awake for 4 hours in pitch darkness. Their torches have been burning, but it's been 15 minutes and it's starting to burn out, and their eyes are getting droopy. And these girls, they're probably in your early teens. They're 14 or 15 years old. They're probably not used to staying up too late because oil is expensive, and so to keep a light burning through the night just was not something that happened. And they get tired, and they eventually fall asleep. Now, there are times that sleep can cause problems. There was an article that ran in the British newspaper called The Telegraph a while ago. It was talking about a town in Spain called Huesca, and the people of Huesca had woken up at about 4:30 in the morning with 1,300 sheep roaming their streets. There was just a lot of noise, and they woke up and they called the Spanish emergency number, and the police went to investigate, and what they found was a shepherd who was waiting to move his flock through the town of Huesca to the fields on the other side, but he was supposed to do it at 7:30 in the morning. And so he was supposed to kind of keep his sheep corralled until then, but he had fallen asleep. And so they finally roused him, and they went around town, and they gathered up all of these sheep that had wandered through town. And so sometimes we see that sleep causes problems, and we know that, and maybe you've experienced that. You've slept in past an appointment that was important, and you had to reschedule or whatever it was, call into work because you messed up. But in this story that Jesus is telling, sleep's not the problem, all right? Both the wise and the foolish girls fall asleep. It's not one of them falling asleep while the other one stays awake. And the sleep happens because of the delay. And there are times where we can fall asleep as Christians as we are waiting for Jesus to come back. It's been 2,000 years. And maybe it's going to happen before the end of this sermon, but maybe it's going to happen another 100 years from now. Whatever it does happen, we might find ourselves asleep. The question is, are we prepared when we wake up? And that is what Jesus' story is about. As to whether or not Jesus is going to come back, that's a question that gets asked all the time, even in the first century world. 30 years after Jesus had died and ascended into heaven after his resurrection, we read what Peter says. Peter says this. He says, they will say, where is the coming he has promised? Ever since the ancestors died, everything goes on as it always has since the beginning of creation. And even in Peter's day, even 30 years after Jesus had died, people were asking, are we sure he's coming back? When is that going to happen? And now we can still have that same problem. Is Jesus coming back? And the answer to that is yes. Our God is faithful. Our God has made promises, and our God fulfills the promises he's made. But the truth we learn here is that maybe there's a delay. And we do not know when Jesus will come back. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe when our grandchildren are grown and have kids of their own. Whenever Jesus comes back, are we ready? The second truth that we see in this story is this: the wise are prepared for the unexpected coming. And we read about it in what happens in verses, the next couple of verses, 6 and 7, I think. It says, at midnight, the cry rang out, Here is the bridegroom, come out and meet him. And then all the virgins woke up and they trimmed their lamps. So everything has finally been settled at the house of the bride, and the groom sends out a runner at midnight to wake up the city, right? He's yelling at the top of his lungs, the party is about to start. Now, most of us, if we're asleep, we don't want to be woken up at midnight, right? My neighbors a couple of years ago let out their dog at about 1 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday night, and the dog began to bark and bark and bark. And my father-in-law was visiting us at that time, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, my father-in-law got tired of the barking and went over to the neighbors, knocked on their door, and said, "Hey, your dog is keeping everybody awake." We don't like to be woken up in the middle of the night. But in this culture, this was what was expected. Everyone was excited about this wedding, and because it is so long, maybe they had fallen asleep as well. And it would have been rude not to send a runner to wake them all up. The groom is coming. He is on his way. And as the ladies wake up, they begin to do the one thing that they're supposed to do. See, they have one job in this party, and that is to light the way. There's going to be a crowd of people walking through the city, and it's dark. There's no street lamps. Their one job is to make everyone get there safely and to give them light to see by. And 5 of them, they are prepared, and they are able to light the way, and 5 of them are able to get a spark to light their torches whose oils have ran out. And we see that the wise, they are prepared. Are we ready? Are we prepared for when Jesus comes? His coming is unexpected, and there is an expectation that we make preparations for when he does appear. When I was in college, we had room inspections. It was expected that we would make our beds on a everyday basis, and that we were to take out our trash and to wash the dishes that we might have had in our rooms. And so every week they would come in, and they were supposed to be surprise visits, but we learned pretty quickly that room inspections took place at Thursdays at 7 p.m., at least on my floor. And so Thursdays at 6:45 p.m., you could see a scurry of people running through and making sure that their trash was taken out and that they had time to clean their dishes. But what really caused problems on our floor was when the dorm dad decided to do it on a Tuesday instead of a Thursday. And everybody that had not made their beds since last Thursday, or had not taken out their trash since last Thursday, or had not washed their dishes since last Thursday, were in a scurry to get everything done. And then if you're the last one in the room, or last room on the floor, it was better, right? And so we understand the scurry that can happen. And the question is, are we ready? We get the choice of whether or not we are going to prepare for the unexpected. Are we going to be cleaning our rooms, waiting for the dorm dad to come by, or are we going to be caught in the washroom washing our dishes? Which one will we be, the wise or the foolish? We don't know when Jesus is coming back, but we have the expectation to be prepared. The third truth we find in this story is that preparations cannot be shared. And we read about that in verses 8 and 9. It says this, "The foolish ones said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out.' And the wise ones reply, 'No, there may not be enough for both of us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves.'" The wise had only brought enough oil for themselves to maybe light it twice, and there's still the fear that maybe they don't have enough oil to go around, and so they tell their companions, no. And what we see very early is that the preparations I make in preparing myself for when Jesus comes back, I cannot give that away. I cannot share with those who have not made themselves ready. I cannot allow them to take a part of what it is, otherwise I might miss out as well. Preparations are things that we must do on our own, and we are each responsible for our own preparations. Gary Richmond writes about a time that he watched a giraffe being born. He had gotten to the zoo, and as he was sitting there, he saw the mother giraffe standing up, and he could see the first part of the legs of the baby giraffe coming out. And he's talking, as Gary writes, he says, I was talking to the zookeeper, and I asked the zookeeper, well, when is the mom going to lay down? Because giraffes are tall, all right? And just imagine a baby coming out 10 feet off the ground, right? All right, and so he's kind of concerned. He says, when is the mom going to lay down? And the zookeeper says, oh, she won't lay down. This is how they give birth. And so then Gary's like, wait a second, who's going to catch the baby then? And the zookeeper says, if you want to catch the baby, you can, but the giraffe can kick your head off if she really wants to, too. So we just kind of let it go naturally, right? All right, and so they're watching it. Finally, the baby plops out, and it's starting to maybe just kind of start to stand, but it's not making much progress. And he says that the mother giraffe kicked the baby giraffe and caused it to go tumbling head over hooves. And Gary's like, why'd she do that? And the zookeeper says she wants the baby to stand up. And so every time the baby gets to a place where it's feeling weak, not quite there, the mother giraffe would kick it over and over again. Finally, the baby giraffe gets up on all four legs, and the mother giraffe looks at it for a little bit and then kicks it again to knock it over. And the zookeeper explained that in the wild, the giraffe needs to be ready to constantly get up and to constantly follow the herd, and the mother giraffe wants the baby to know to be ready. And the preparations that baby giraffe made for life to be able to live, it's preparations only that baby giraffe could do. No one could take the kicks of the giraffe, of the mother giraffe, for that baby. It was preparations that baby alone had to endure. And in the same way, we must make our own preparations. No one else can do it for us. We alone are responsible for ourselves. Are you ready? The fourth truth that we find in this story is this: the unprepared find themselves outside of the feast. And we read about in verses 10 through 12, it says that while the foolish girls were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the others, the foolish, also came, and they began to knock on the door, and they said, Lord, Lord, open the door for us. And the groom replied, truly I tell you, I don't know you. Now, it'd probably be kind of insane for us to assume that the groom actually didn't know them. All right, it's a part of his wedding preparations. He probably knows who these bridesmaids are. But in that culture, anytime you wanted to cut ties with someone for whatever reason, you would simply say to them, I don't know you. So if you had a friend that betrayed your bond of friendship, and you decided that you no longer wanted to be friends with them, you would simply go to them and say, I don't know you. And these bridesmaids, their one job in this was to light the way. And they had failed in this one task that they had. And so when they get to the door and they ask, can we come in? The shame that they have brought not only the bride and the groom, but also upon their families is too much. And the groom says, I don't know you. Interestingly, Jesus says something very similar earlier in the book of Matthew. As he's talking on the Sermon on the Mount, he will say these words in chapter 7. It says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom, but only those who do the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me. And when we understand that these words aren't Jesus saying, I never knew you, as in you were never a part of my people, but rather Jesus disassociating himself with them. I don't know who you are. Then we can understand the importance of being ready, the importance of making preparations for the coming of the King. Because there's going to be a day where we either are wise and we've prepared, or we're foolish and we've not prepared. And if we're not prepared, Jesus will disown us. And we'll say, I don't know who you are. The unprepared are left outside of the kingdom. The unprepared have not done what is necessary to find themselves into the wedding feasts. And the groom does not know him. Well, every parable has a main point, and the main point is found in verse 13 of this parable, and it says this: Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. We must be ready for the coming of the King. And in our lives, we get the choice of which type of bridesmaids we will be. Will we be wise? Will we go through the process of preparing ourselves for the coming of the King? Will we do the things that are necessary to do the will of God so that we will not be disassociated from Jesus? Will we be prepared, or will we be foolish and not do the things necessary to prepare ourselves for when the King comes? In the kingdom of heaven, there is no room for procrastination. We don't get to put it off to the last minute, because the things that we put off to the last minute will cause us to miss the parade into the festival, into the wedding feast of the Lamb. We must be constantly ready. In 1835, a man by the name of James Gordon Bennett started a newspaper called the New York Herald. I think it's still around. When he started this paper, it made him stupid rich, okay? He had more money than he knew what he was doing with. When we read about his life, we find that he had two Paris apartments in different parts of the town. He also had estates out on the French countryside. He had a yacht that was harbored in Europe somewhere at different places, different times. He also owned 3 houses in the United States, a country he had not lived in for 10 years. And each one of those were staffed by servants. And James Bennett would never really tell his staff which house he was staying at that night. And so the staff at each of these houses had to be prepared. And so they made sure there was a cellar full of food and wine, and every single fireplace, every single night had a roaring fire in it to heat and warm up the house. Every single bed was turned down every night just in case the master showed up. And like those servants, we must be ready just in case Jesus shows up. Just in case the King comes back today. Just in case it is now. Are we prepared? And maybe we're left with the question of how do we prepare? We know that we need to be ready. How? And the rest of chapter 25 kind of describes it. Jesus gives us 2 more parables. We're going to look at one in detail in a couple of weeks. But basically the parables go like this. The first parable that Jesus tells, he tells about a king who has 3 servants, and he gives the servants a set of money. And he says, you guys do what you need to do while I am away. And the king goes away, and he comes back, and 2 of the servants have doubled their master's money, and one of them has done nothing with it. And it's that servant that is punished. And what we see from that story is this: one way that we prepare is by faithfully using God's gifts that He has given us. The time that we have, the ability He has given us, the money He has given to us. We need to use them wisely as good stewards. That is part of our preparation for the coming of the King. And then the next story, Jesus tells us about how a shepherd goes out and he separates the sheep from the goats. And what determines who's a sheep and who's a goat in the kingdom is what they do habitually. And those who habitually serve other people, those are a part of the kingdom. And if we want to be a part of the kingdom, part of our preparations is serving others naturally, habitually, without question. Are you preparing? Are you using your gifts wisely? Are you serving other people? Are you being wise and preparing for when the King comes? Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, we're grateful that you have promised to give us a kingdom that is full of glory and that shares in the richness of who you are. And Lord, we're grateful that you are a faithful God who fulfills the promises you make. And Lord, there may be times in our lives where we question, are you coming? Or where maybe we fall asleep as we're waiting for you to come. And Lord, when those things happen, help us to recognize that you can come at any point in time and that we must be ready, that we must keep watch, and that we must be wise as we prepare for the coming of the King. It's your name we pray. Amen.